This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. James Fallows was a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter. He reflects on the achievements of the 39th president. Political scientist Jennifer Lawless has surveyed 4,000 high school and college students and found that 9 out of 10 have no interest in ever running for office. She explains why. And Emma Roller of the National Journal talks presidential politics with Bill Press. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. President Jimmy Carter should be remembered for many things, says his speechwriter James Fallows, not the least of which is deregulation, which paved the way for, among other things, microbreweries. And we say hello to James Fallows, national correspondent for The Atlantic and former editor of U.S. News and World Report, and for 2 years was chief speechwriter for President Carter. We have asked him to join us today on americasdemocrats.org to reminisce about the remarkable career of our nation's 39th president. James Fallows, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure. Thanks for giving me the chance.
Well, we appreciate it. As we all are, of course, thinking of Jimmy Carter these days, do you feel frustrated that his legacy is one of a failed presidency?
I think it's less frustration than just maybe it is frustration at historical imprecision, because President Carter was trying to manage the country in a very, very difficult time. It was a time of worldwide hyperinflation, of the oil shocks, the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War. It was a very difficult time around the world, including in the United States. And I think there are a lot of things that both at the time he was able to accomplish, from the Camp David agreements to the Panama Canal Treaty to having the energy bill, and many others that in retrospect look even better. So I wish that the view of him would combine some understanding of the very difficult times in which he was trying to do things with a view of the pluses and minuses.
Now, I'm sure that you feel he has been shortchanged by the public and historians. In what ways does he not get proper credit for his successes? And you mentioned a couple of them right there.
I think that when people look back on there's one whole category that's almost never mentioned in President Carter's achievement, which was the beginning of the mainly good deregulation after excessive regulation in the 1960s and 70s. It seems strange to talk about a Democrat doing that, but for example, every time you go to a microbrewery any place in the United States now, which is in its golden age of beer, you should thank Jimmy Carter. He was the guy who essentially deregulated home brewing, and everybody who's a pioneer in that field says, yes, it was because of President Carter. If you go to Latin America, the Panama Canal Treaty had an enormous effect in sort of it lancing what was becoming an increasingly difficult irritant between the U.S. and Latin American countries. If you go, as I have, to Eastern Europe or to the former Soviet Union, the human rights standard that President Carter planted, he was not saying that this would be an absolute black or white, all or nothing part of U.S. policy, but it would matter more than it had in the past. And many people who were there in the transformation of the Soviet Empire give credit to him. The relationship with China was really solidified during his time. And of course, that's not even talking about energy and the environment, where he signed a lot of protections for native lands, for wild lands, and of course had the energy goals, which if we'd followed them, we'd be in better shape now.
Mm-hmm. You know, I would say that almost everybody recognizes President Carter's morality, Christianity, decency, but can't those traits actually get in the way of using power effectively?
They can, and one point I made a year or two ago in a big piece about President Obama for The Atlantic, where I've worked ever since I left the Carter administration, is that the demands on a modern president are so enormous, broad, and unrelenting that any president is going to fall short in some of them. If somebody is a very, very good manipulator, then we might think that he or she doesn't have the right ethical compass. If he's a good public speaker, he might not be a good private persuader, et cetera. I think in President Carter's case, he was elected in 1976 in large part because of a sense of a failure of public morality. After President Nixon had to resign, with the decade of the Vietnam War just coming to an end. And I think the values that Jimmy Carter as a candidate had of saying that we need to be better, we need a government that is more in tune with what we think America should be, they gave him some public backing, and they had some influence, but not complete influence, in his private negotiations. He was a better negotiator than most people think, but he was not fundamentally a creature of the Congress, a creature of Washington, and so he did run into some of those impediments. Yet, yes, I think that the main point I'd make, too, is that if people are thinking of Jimmy Carter as an inflexible moral prig who would just walk away from a bargaining table if things weren't going his way, he was not that way at all. He was a man of the world, but he wasn't a Washington creature, and therefore had some difficulties with the Congress.
We're speaking with James Fallows, national correspondent for The Atlantic, and for 2 years, the chief speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter. James, President Carter joked that he might have had a second term if he had sent one more helicopter on that hostage rescue mission. Maybe there was something to that. Everyone remembers that mission. Everyone talks about how that was the downfall. But was he really, in fact, doomed by the economy, gasoline prices, the hostage crisis itself? I mean, was it more to it than that?
Well, there's a case he can make that if that rescue mission had succeeded and he wasn't dogged by the Iranian captivity, which reached its first anniversary on Election Day, and that if he had some sense of being lucky rather than unlucky, of having everything go against him, things might have been different. Part of the case he would make is that even within a week of the election, the polls were still very, very close. It was just the final debate, the only debate between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan a week before the election, where things started to diverge. So you can argue it either way. You can argue that it was towards the end a close election, which we now forget, because we think of Ronald Reagan as this triumphant second two-term president who all Republicans now adulate, and even Democratic presidents do. But there is Jimmy Carter is not entirely making it up when he says that he might have stayed in there for a second term had the Iranian situation gone differently.
Now, do you think at all that the Iranians waited until Inauguration Day to release the hostages because they wanted to humiliate President Carter, or perhaps they were somehow afraid of Ronald Reagan?
The Reagan team, well, certainly it's clear that they waited. I remember very vividly Inauguration Day of 1980, and they were having the swearing-in ceremony, and essentially, as soon as it was done, as soon as Jimmy Carter was out of command, the Iranians said, okay, we can make a deal. The Republican line on this was that it's because they were so fearful of the powerful Ronald Reagan. I think it's much more likely in the facts of those times it was part of their spite at President Carter, and the reason they were spiteful to him is the rescue mission, the Iranian Revolution led by the Ayatollah of those days was largely against the Shah, with whom Jimmy Carter had been allied and was supporting. So I think it was more a gesture of spite towards the previous president than of quaking fear of the new one.
Now, if you were say, going to rank things for us, what do you think was President Carter's greatest policy achievement, both foreign policy and domestic policy?
In terms of simple achievements, I would have to say his engineering the Camp David peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. I say that for two reasons. One is it was clearly Jimmy Carter's achievement. I actually was there during those negotiations in 1978, and it was his force of will, his force of intellect and attention to detail and presenting the big picture to both President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel, that without Jimmy Carter that would never have happened. So that's one reason it's significant. The second is that it's the only Middle Eastern peace that has lasted. And so the fact that he was able to achieve that and bring two tough leaders from countries that have been at war together, I think that is something that no one can ever take away from him.
You know, it's interesting. You would think that people would make references to that, given our times right now and what's going on in the Middle East, because that really was a huge breakthrough in our history, and no one ever seems to talk about it anymore.
Well, that's why I'm glad we're mentioning it here. I agree with you. And the only silver lining of the very sad news that President Carter was diagnosed at age 90 with cancer is that there is some time when maybe people have occasion to reflect, while he is around to hear it, on the achievements he had when he was in office.
Now, as a speechwriter, and with all due modesty, what would you say is his best speech? And maybe you could share, perhaps now, maybe the worst, too.
Modesty came naturally to people on the Carter speechwriting staff because he was not famous for his success as a formal orator, and we all shared in that lack of glory. The speech, I think, holds up well is one that he did in Notre Dame in 1977 about his human rights policy, because I think he laid out then carefully and clearly what seems like a contradiction. The contradiction is the United States has to stand for something in human rights, even if it can't sublimate everything else to that. That the fact that you had to sometimes deal with dictators, sometimes had to deal with unsavory regimes, sometimes had to do things you didn't really like, the fact that that was a reality of life did not mean that you could not still place emphasis on standing up for these principles wherever you could. I think that speech stands rereading. Many of the speeches we did in the effort to pass the energy bill were not very good at the time or afterwards, but I'm happy to have people read the Notre Dame speech.
Okay. Fair enough. James Fallows, national correspondent for The Atlantic, and, of course, for 2 years, chief speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter. James, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks very much.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. School is back in session, and political scientist Jennifer Lawless finds that almost no one in high school or college has any desire to ever run for office. They were born after Newt Gingrich made government the enemy. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In their ongoing all-out assault to crush labor unions, corporate forces have fabricated a cultural myth to undermine popular support for labor. Unions, they insist, are no longer needed. They tell us that in today's entrepreneurial economy, workers must compete with each other, not cooperate. Before swallowing that wad of hornswoggle, let's revisit Flight 1549. As it took off from New York City in 2009, the jet hit a flock of geese, lost all power, and had nowhere to try a crash landing. But Captain Sully Sullenberger knew what to do: use the Hudson River as a landing strip. Amazingly, it worked. Dubbed the Miracle on the Hudson, the lives of all 150 passengers were saved. But no supernatural powers were at work. Captain Sully himself is not only a member of the Airline Pilots Association, but also served on that union's National Governing Committee and was its former safety chairman. Indeed, he and the APA union have had to fight airline chieftains who keep trying to cut back on the safety training programs that teach crews how to save lives. Nor was Sully alone in this miracle. The cool-headed flight attendants who quickly moved 150 nearly panicked people off the plane were members of the Association of Flight Attendants, another union that trains to avert disasters. The ferry crews that zipped into action, skillfully maneuvering their boats within 4 inches of the plane's wings to rescue passengers, they're in the Seafarers International Union, which gives them the safety courses that enable them to respond as they did. The cops, firefighters, and air traffic controllers also perform marvelously, all union-trained. This is Jim Hightower saying, at a time when corporate interests in all sectors of our economy are trying to eliminate unions, remember Flight 1549, the union-made Miracle on the Hudson.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Young people have no interest in running for office, ever. Political scientist Jennifer Lawless says it's because they find politics dysfunctional and a waste of time. And we say hello to Jennifer Lawless, a government professor at American University in Washington. She's the author, along with Richard Fox, of a new book called Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. Jennifer Lawless, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're glad to have you with us. You and your co-author, I mentioned Richard Fox, paint a pretty depressing picture of the millennials and post-millennials, the younger cohort of voters who are now entering their productive years, but who have no interest in participating in the political process. What does that apathy portend?
That's exactly right. We did a national survey of about 4,000 high school and college students, and what we found was that 9 out of 10 have already decided pretty unequivocally that they have absolutely no interest in running for office, any office, whether it be at the local, state, or federal level. And so given that we have 500,000 elective offices in this country, that does not bode well for the future. We want our best and our brightest to aspire to basically make policy and improve conditions of people throughout the country and throughout the world. And if these people have decided already that electoral means is not an appealing way for them to do so, it doesn't necessarily leave us with a rosy outlook.
Now, you take a survey of 4,000 high school and college students. What did you find regarding their complaints about the political system?
In general, we found that the reason they're not interested in running for office is because they think that politics is completely dysfunctional, ineffective, mired in gridlock, a waste of time, and full of scandal and dishonest politicians.
But we all know that. Right? I mean, yeah, that's part of the game.
Unfortunately, it is part of the game, but it's also an unrepresentative part of the game.
But
what we also found was that those are the stories that generate the kind of media coverage that young people are exposed to. So what happens is they wind up seeing only the worst and the most nefarious aspects of electoral politics. They see time and again examples of Washington politicians not getting things done, failing to achieve compromise, and they see scandal after scandal after scandal, whether it be a sex scandal or financial impropriety or trying to evade the truth. And that becomes the lens through which they view all politicians. So they think about their first political memories of Bill Clinton lying about Monica Lewinsky or of George Bush lying about weapons of mass destruction, and they assume that it's those types of people who actually occupy all 500,000 elective offices across the country, and those people are not like them.
And there isn't that interest in changing things or trying to make things better. There's nothing that's getting them over that hump, is there?
Well, it's interesting. They grew up in a time where this is pretty much the only thing they've known. Yeah. And so after Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House, after the 1994 elections, there became a very real message on the Republican side that was, we need less government, and we don't need you to support the government, right? Like, this anti-government message became a legitimate means. And since then, we've also seen hyper-partisan maneuvering, and we've seen it become completely acceptable for both sides to say, compromise is a dirty word, we're not doing it. So there's no better time for these kids to look back to because this is all they've ever known, which means that it's difficult for them to envision a different kind of politics because they've never been exposed to a different kind of politics.
And so we end up with fewer and fewer people running for office. Obviously, that's got to make things worse. You get a smaller pool of candidates who thus become more venal and self-serving.
That's right. Well, there's no question that we'll always be able to fill these positions. The question is with what quality of person. Yeah. And as long as this is an unappealing job and it's not held in any degree of high regard, what we see are parents not encouraging their kids to think about running for office, teachers not pushing their best students to think about running for office, coaches and other mentors not even mentioning to the people that they think are going to be highly successful that politics could be a useful career path. And why would they? They have the same opinions about the political system as these kids do. So if they want these young people to succeed, they certainly don't want to push them into a political direction.
We're speaking with Jennifer Lawless, government professor at American University, co-author with Richard Fox of a new book called Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. Jennifer, there's apparently an age at which a youngster decides whether he or she is cut out for a life in politics. What is that age? And after that, is it hopeless?
It's hard to pinpoint a specific age, but a lot of research has found that by the time you're about 16 or 17 years old, the career preferences and the kinds of interests that you have map pretty well onto what you'll ultimately do. So if by that time or around that time you decide that something is completely not an option, it's very unlikely that it will come back to you as a viable opportunity later on. And that's why it's so important to change the minds of high school and college students, because it's during that time that these kinds of decisions about whether they want to get into politics, whether they want to pursue a law career, whether they want to go into medicine, really begin to take shape. It's not hopeless because there are obviously circumstances in adults' lives that can motivate them to get involved. But when we've surveyed adults who are well situated to run, people that are lawyers, business leaders, educators, political activists, and we ask them if they've ever thought about running, the ones who have tend to remember first thinking about it when they were in high school or college.
You know, you mentioned Newt Gingrich, 94, and the whole contract with America and all that. Do you think that politics actually started taking an ugly turn, maybe even further back, when President Reagan and the subsequent generation of Republicans began to denounce government itself?
I do. Ronald Reagan had that famous line where he said, you know, the 9 words that are the most fearful that you should hear are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, right? That paints the government in this terrible light. I think it took a little bit of time for that to stick, but you have Republican candidates now who are running against government, people like Ted Cruz, saying that they came of age and were inspired by Ronald Reagan. So I think that's exactly right. What Newt Gingrich did that was a little bit different was make it completely acceptable to pride yourself on failing to accomplish anything and to stymie the other side. And then we saw Mitch McConnell take that to a brand new level when he said right after Barack Obama was inaugurated that the Republicans' goal was to ensure that he was a one-term president.
Yeah, that's a way to get things done, huh?
Yeah, that really inspires hope.
It's just unbelievable. And, you know, you would think, if you didn't know any better, you would think that was one of those situations where he didn't know his mic was on. He stood out in front of people and said that. I mean, it's outlandish to me. But anyway, President Obama had a strong hold on the allegiance of young people who, in either party, could duplicate that loyalty. And is Obama to blame for seeming to be hypocritical to young progressive voters?
Well, I will say that Obama was the one beacon of light in all of our survey findings, in that about 2/3 of the young people still did say that they were somewhat inspired by him. And people who were inspired by him were at least a little bit more likely to consider running. Now, again, the overwhelming majority have no interest in doing this. But if a couple of politicians could signal increased interest, that can go a long way. The good news is that this field of candidates on both the Democratic and the Republican side know that they need to get young people to turn out to vote if they want to win the election. The Democrats need to get out a much greater ratio because younger people tend to favor Democratic candidates, but both sides, I think, will try to appeal to young people because, in part, that was how Barack Obama was so successful in 2008. I think it's an open question as to whether they're going to succeed. It's hard to imagine after what we saw in 2008 that the expectations for a presidential candidate that can reach young people won't be exceedingly high.
I also sit here thinking that it's kind of crazy to me that you have people in government preaching how bad government is. I mean, they were elected to a government position, and here they are touting how bad government is, and you don't want them in your back pocket and all that sort of thing. It just and nobody sees through that.
Or that they will get rid of the Supreme Court because we don't need that, right? Government has 3 branches. So it's one of these things where it's kind of unbelievable when we see the messages that are sent out and transmitted that even 1 out of 10 young people is interested in running for office.
Mm-hmm. So suddenly now I'm not so surprised about all the young Americans and how turned off they are to the politics. But in all seriousness, how much of the blame for the apathy among young people toward electoral politics should be placed on a media culture? I think you touched on that briefly earlier, but because that turns politics into comedy and thinks news is what the Kardashians did today. I mean, it's kind of where it is right now as far as where these folks are getting their news from.
It is, and they would much rather access current events that are about the Kardashians than are about what Congress managed to do or what the Supreme Court decided. Our concern about media, though, transcends that because we're willing to say, okay, look, there is this blurring between news and entertainment, but it turns out that young people are not really focusing on entertainment that's pretending to be news. They're focusing almost exclusively on entertainment. The problem is when you have a news environment a hard news environment that has no incentive to put anything into perspective. And so if you turn on the nightly news or if you look at headlines on CNN or MSNBC, almost all of them tout failure, stalemate, the inability to get things done, scandal, infighting. And even when there is a legislative success, within 5 seconds, questions come up as to whether that was a justified success, whether there were politics playing behind the scenes. And so it's very difficult to get any sense of accomplishment or to see anything that's actually working well because the bottom line incentives of news organizations mean keeping ratings up, and that means highlighting what's bad or unusual or noteworthy or devastating or nefarious. And so as a result, it's very difficult to see anything working the way that it should. So if you're just a casual viewer or you're flipping through the channels, you're not going to see anything that looks like it was a good day in Washington, a good day at your state capitol, or even a good day in your community.
I remember a long, long time ago in a different life, and somebody told me, you've never seen a good news newspaper because they're not successful. I guess that's where we are. People just, and the news organizations have jumped on that and they run with it like crazy.
I think that's right. And I think it's naive to think that they're going to change. But the one thing that they actually could do is put it a little bit into perspective. And even if they're going to spend almost all of their time highlighting and focusing on the negative, when something actually good happens or when a bill does get through and there is a lot of support behind it, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to actually frame at least part of that story, chronicling the compromises that were made and the efforts behind the scenes that allowed for something to get done.
Absolutely. The name of the book, Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. Co-author Jennifer Lawless, government professor at American University, joining us today. Jennifer, thank you so much for your time with us. We enjoyed it, and we wish to have you back here sometime on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect Stand Up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Emma Roller of the National Journal.
It looks like she will be on stage in the second Republican debate. Carly Fiorina has been out there campaigning across the country after performing what everybody thought doing a good job in the first Republican debate. And she's been trailed by Emma Roller from National Journal, nationaljournal.com, who bounces from the campaign trail to the Bill Press studio this morning. Hi, Emma.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
How's Iowa?
It was great. I was telling Peter I probably ate, twice as many calories as normal.
What was the craziest thing you ate at the fair?
I didn't go to the fair.
Oh,
no.
you did.
What did you eat that was so crazy in Iowa? Because they've got...
Well, the thing about Iowa is that, so I was staying in a lot of, hotels in rural Iowa, and hotels in Iowa, their breakfast, they always have biscuits and gravy, which is like, for me, I'm a Midwesterner, I love it, but also like the idea of eating biscuits and gravy for breakfast, like while also traveling around and being on the campaign trail is probably not the most healthy thing.
Right.
So it's probably that.
I'm a big biscuits and gravy fan, but that
you're a Southern boy.
Yeah, that's
it's a Southern thing too.
That's
right?
the whole idea, though. Is you eat that and then you go out and work in the fields all day.
Yeah.
No, you
Which
don't.
I was not really doing.
That's where it came from.
Yeah, 100 years ago.
Yeah, right. That's where it came from.
All right.
So now
but you were following Carly Fiorina around.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of events? What kind of crowds? What kind of reception?
Sure. So the thing that I noticed following Fiorina's campaign around is, first of all...
Did she have a big press pack with her?
You mean on her campaign?
No.
Like reporters? No, not at all. It was probably me
It's like you and Carly, huh?
Me and Carly, the title of my forthcoming memoir.
Carly and me.
Yes. No, but she attracted some fairly large crowds. It was all in northwest Iowa, which is a lot more rural than, Iowa City, Des Moines. So a lot of rural crowds. And she ended her trip speaking to the Iowa Corn Growers Association in Des Moines, which was it was actually interesting.
You made that up.
No, it was like their annual meeting. And she was speaking to them about ethanol subsidies and the renewable fuel standards. And she wants to get rid of all of those subsidies, all energy subsidies by 2022 when the renewable fuel standard sunsets. So if you can imagine in a room packed full of Iowa corn farmers that didn't go over so well, but they appreciated her. She was the only candidate who showed up. And other Iowa Republicans I talked to, a lot of them came into the event knowing next to nothing about her. And talking to them before the event versus after the event, a lot of them were impressed with her. She's someone who's able to come into a room and really do the retail politics that it takes in Iowa, the person-to-person interaction, making people feel like she's talking to them.
Is she good at that?
I found that she's very good at that. We saw her in the debate, on the first debate, and everyone, like you said, people thought that she sort of won the happy hour debate. But if you see her in these small Iowa crowds, she does a good job of, the sort of handshaking and photo taking with supporters.
Now, every time you hear her introduced, or every time you see her, most of the times you see her referred to in the media, it's always as the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard.
Right.
Has anybody looked at her record as CEO, and isn't that going to come back and bite her in the butt?
Yeah, well, that's something that came up on the trail a couple of times, is that, even an Iowa Republican stood up at one point and asked, well, how do you reconcile your record at Hewlett-Packard? Because she was essentially pushed out. And her answer... After
30,000 people, I think was the number, lost their jobs?
Huge layoffs, yeah. And her sort of spin on that was, look, I'm an innovator. Innovators push the status quo, and I pushed the status quo and became unpopular for that reason.
And sank the company.
That's a terrible answer, honestly. I think part of the reason that she has had some of this popularity is that no one in the Republican field, anyway, has really pushed her on that. And nobody on the Democratic side has the time to even bother with that.
I don't think anyone in the Republican field has necessarily taken her seriously enough yet to do that. But now that she's going to be on the main stage of the debate, we'll probably start seeing more attacks like that.
Okay, so you got to my next question, which is she's been raising hell because of the rules that CNN and the Republican Party had agreed to determine who would be on the grown-up debate for this next one. I think the rules were unfair. They weighed far too much to before the first debate, where her success has been since the first debate. But she successfully got them yesterday to do a total 180, change the rules, so it looks like she's going to be on stage. Now people are saying, oh, that's just a case of Republicans doing affirmative action, which they're always opposed to. At least Rachel Maddow made that charge on MSNBC. And Laura Ingraham had Carly Fiorina on yesterday, and Carly fights back.
It's really kind of outrageous. When you earn it, people say it's affirmative action. I earned this place by virtue of my position in the polls. No one else in the race has gone from the bottom 17 to the top 10.
There it is. She may be top 10 or top 11, but whatever. Looks like she is going to be on stage. So.
Right, and that's something
But aren't the Republicans, don't they they want to be sure they have at least one black and one woman on stage?
Well, I think that the RNC is certainly aware of the optics of keeping someone like Carly Fiorina off the stage, the only woman candidate on their side. But on the other hand, it's not like her charges or her complaints were not legitimate. Like you said,
the legitimate complaint.
Yeah, the CNN criteria was weighted for the much earlier polls without really taking into account people who gained popularity after the first debate. But I think it does raise a question of, does this mean that for future debates, if any, lower tier candidate takes issue with the debate criteria, are they going to just, lob similar complaints and just to try to get them to change them?
As Steve Shepard also pointed out in our last hour, the way they changed the rules, they changed them it would help her, but would not hurt the other guys.
Right.
So meaning they're going to have to accept more than 10 people on stage, probably just 11, maybe 12. But I mean,
sure.
They're kind of trying to keep everybody happy.
Right. There was some speculation that maybe she would kick off, someone like Chris Christie or John Kasich, but in all likelihood, they'll all be staying on.
All right. The other thing the Republicans are trying to do to make peace among the candidates is they are circulating a pledge today to ask all 17 Republican candidates to agree not to run as the third-party candidate and to support the Republican nominee if it doesn't happen to be him or her. What's Donald Trump going to do?
So today, Donald Trump is meeting with Reince Priebus, the head of the RNC, in New York City, which I would love to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. Can you imagine?
That's going to be pretty spectacular.
Donald Trump will beat that little pipsqueak up.
Yeah. In all honesty, we've seen Reince Priebus.
He could just bat him around like a cat with a mouse. What do you mean?
Yeah. How many times do you think he'll call Reince a loser in the meeting? No, but and they're having a press conference about this at 2 p.m. So it seems all signs are pointing to Trump will probably reluctantly come around and say, yes, I'll support the Republican nominee.
How can he do that? How can he do that after the first debate when he raised his hand and said, no way, no how? He would not pledge.
Because he's Donald Trump. He's, as one strategist put it to me lately, he defies all laws of political gravity.
He does. But we'll find out who's right and who's wrong here before the end of the day. I can't, I'm on my way to New York right after the show.
You should go.
Maybe I should go right to the Trump Tower. Yeah. Get my media pass and get in there. But I don't see how Donald Trump can continue to have his success, which is based on being an outsider, not part of the establishment, taking on the party establishment, taking on the party leaders, and sign that pledge. I mean, for the rest of them, it's really not even a question because none of them have the resources to be able to do it. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is the only one who could do it. Why should he give that up? What does he get by giving that up? Do you think the party's going to treat him any better?
No, I mean, probably not, but...
No. Yeah.
I could see a universe where if he does hold fast and say, no, I'm going to run as a third-party candidate, then Republican primary voters will start... If I were a Republican primary voter, I'd see that as selfish.
But his leverage, right, and he said that, his leverage is support me, make me your nominee, right? And if you don't, we're going to do this.
Right.
So he's kind of holding them hostage.
The other part of this, of course, is so maybe he signs the pledge,
Oh.
and then maybe he breaks it because he's Donald Trump. Do you think he
Right.
cares about a piece of paper with his name on it?
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, if you're Donald Trump, you could sign the pledge.
Oh, yeah, okay, sure, I'll sign the pledge. Yeah, okay.
Right.
Can you
Ignore
imagine? Just imagine him in the United Nations being.
Yeah. Of course I signed the pledge. I signed it because Reince Priebus, who was a total loser and a very small man, asked me to.
Mm-hmm. That was then. This is now.
Yeah, right. Things have changed.
I'm Donald Trump.
Very successful businessman.
Right. Emma Roller from National Journal. Been on the road with Carly Fiorina. You were not in Miami yesterday, but at Miami-Dade Community College. Emma, Vice President Joe Biden there just to talk about community college and the president's goal to have everybody have at least 2 years free of community college. And there were over 20 TV cameras and a whole crowd of reporters there to see Joe Biden back in action in public. And everybody was talking about this. This was sort of the kickoff of his. He's actually, for 3 days, he's talking in 6 different cities. Started yesterday, and people are saying this is the kickoff of his 2016 campaign. Do you think it is?
Well, I think you mentioned the presence of all the TV cameras. He made a joke at the speech like, oh, I'm glad everyone's so interested in community college.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right. But, I was reading, my colleague Lauren Fox wrote about this, that his speech yesterday had a lot of the tenor of a presidential campaign speech. They played a Bruce Springsteen song. There were, tons of reporters there. And, there's sort of this will he or won't he vibe. My gut tells me that he is probably not going to run. I have no hard facts to back that up, but I would love to hear what you guys think.
I think he's going to run, and
really?
I think he should. I hope he does, only because I think the more the merrier. I just think it shakes it up, and he's always wanted to be president, and why not? He's certainly got the experience, as much experience, brings as much to the table as Hillary Clinton does.
It's win-win.
I was born in Delaware.
Ah.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure if he does or not, but it couldn't hurt, right? It's win-win. If he loses, it's stronger.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and this is probably his last shot to do it.
Of course it is.
Yeah. The question is, Clinton's campaign has sucked up so much of the Obama campaign staff talent. I'm not sure what sort of talent pool Biden would be able to draw from.
Let me tell you, there are plenty of out-of-work Democratic strategists around. Yeah.
And as we've seen with the Jeb campaign, they'll jump ship.
Right, that's right.
And jump to another campaign.
I know half of them. I was surprised. The Washington Post a couple of weeks ago had a front-page article of the major contributors to Obama, the bundlers for Obama. And I don't remember the exact number, but there were like 400 or so, right? And they showed how many of those had actually committed to Hillary, and it was like about 72, I think.
Wow.
So there's a big field of major. She's raised a ton of money, but there's a big field of major donors who are still not spoken for. And there are plenty of campaign strategists around, and Biden himself is a pretty savvy politician. I don't know. I think the chances are maybe 60-40 that he would run, but he's not made that decision yet. And he may not. But on the Democratic side, the other thing is, and Bernie Sanders is in Iowa today. Hillary Clinton is up in New Hampshire. ostensibly for the purpose of trying to get back on top in New Hampshire when Bernie Sanders has knocked her out of front place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Bernie has sort of, obviously he's from Vermont, not New Hampshire, but the same geographical support there. Clinton, she seems to be sort of taking her sweet time to prove herself to primary voters. I mean, that's just how I've been seeing it. She's not being super aggressive, but probably some of those polls have been a little bit of a wake-up call.
I think the Hillary campaign started out really strong and has sort of fallen back into this inevitability mode that they were in the last time around.
Well, it started out as a coronation, which it should never have been in the first place. And since there's been competition, principally from Bernie, a little bit from Martin O'Malley at least, then she's been slipping. She's still in strong position. I think chances are she'll still be the Democratic nominee and the next president of the United States. But there's a weakness showing, which enough of a weakness, I think, that could persuade a Joe Biden to say this may be worth a shot.
But I do. Sorry, go ahead.
I just got and on that point, I hate to do this, but we have to end it right there. Out of time.
Until next time.
Emma, exactly. All right. Go back on the road, then come back and tell us all about it. All right.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. James Fallows, Jennifer Lawless, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.